Next up, we'll hear from Cathy Tsagournos from the Assistant Director of Animal Resources at the Tulane National Primate Research Center. Cathy will walk us through Tulane's phased rollout of LabKey Sample Manager, starting with teams migrating from FreezerPro and later expanding to groups coming from spreadsheets and informal tools. She'll share how the project was structured, how they engaged users, and have some great advice for others planning their own transitions from legacy systems.
I am Cathy Chavez. I am the Assistant Director at the Tulane National Primate Research Center. I have over 24 years of operations, human resources, and project management skills. I work a lot in aligning people, processes, and systems. And for the purposes of this presentation, I led the LabKey EHR implementation and the sample manager transition. I have a master's in public administration from Tulane University and a bachelor's in management from the University of New Orleans. So to tell you a little bit about the Primate Center, we are located in Covington, Louisiana. We are one of 7 NIH-funded national primate research centers in the U.S. We support cutting-edge biomedical research aimed at improving human and animal health through studies of infectious disease, neurosciences, and transitional medicine. The center maintains one of the nation's largest and most diverse non-human primate colonies, supported by advanced facilities and comprehensive data management systems. We use platforms like LabKey to integrate and manage research, clinical, and sample data that allows for enhancing collaboration, regulatory compliance, and scientific discovery across multidisciplinary teams. So I'm going to be covering during this session our phased approach to implementing the LabKey Sample Manager module. The first phase was really to transition those users that were using FreezerPro. The second phase, which we're currently still in, is transitioning those that are using spreadsheets or other informal processes of tracking their samples. And then I'm also going to cover our planning, user engagement, and compliance needs. So why the change? The Primate Center is a large, as I mentioned, multi-lab primate center with many different workflows. Prior to Sample Manager, we used a mix of FreezerPro and spreadsheets. Leadership announced in 2025 of March this year that FreezerPro would no longer be a platform that would continue to be supported, and that was going to be effective in June of 2025. So that really forced us to act quickly. That left us with only 3 months to complete phase 1. We also recognized that this was a good opportunity for QA oversight and improved compliance. This was not just a software replacement, it was a chance to modernize our process because it can capture all the data we need, it can track every sample and every process with all the flexibility to allow us to adapt to the different types of labs we have. Moving to Sample Manager gave us a cloud-based platform, freezer management, sample and lineage tracking, assay data management, the electronic lab notebook, which you saw earlier, workflow management, sample querying and reporting, full audit trail capability, and an application programming interface access and support so that we could easily pull and push data between systems and other integrated software tools. Our process actually began in June of 2024 with an announcement, a webinar, and FAQs advertising a free module. And this transition was considered voluntary at this time. By March of 2025, leadership issued the mandate requiring the transition. And in all likelihood, this was related to all of the financial grant funding changes. And so FreezerPro was a platform that we paid for, and Sample Manager was not only just a better system, but it also came with the system in LabKey that we were also using. So again, phase 1 was targeted for just those FreezerPro users, given the imminent sunset of FreezerPro. Phase 2 was bringing those that are using spreadsheets into a more formal normal system using Sample Manager. And this phased approach, which I recommend, just like the prior panelists suggested, a phased approach to really reduce the risk and to ensure that you have engagement throughout the process. So to start off, I created a survey using Qualtrics in order to understand lab practices, the frequency of use, different sample types, and metadata needs. These insights informed us of how we were going to tailor our training, our workflow mapping for each lab. The survey also helped us identify points of contact for each lab, the users, and if the labs would be included in phase 1 or phase 2. So one of the prior questions about who needs to be involved, the survey really helped us identify who the stakeholders were from a lab perspective. The point of contact was so important because, you know, a lab may have 5 or 6 users, but really you need one person in the lab who is going to be, you know, in every meeting, making sure the transition is happening, getting the survey questions answered, speaking and advocating for the lab. It really helped kind of control that process. Most of the points of contacts for labs were the lab managers or the lab supervisors. So from the survey, we determined that we had 61 potential users identified in FreezerPro. The survey revealed about 15 labs had some type of data within the FreezerPro system, with 6 labs actively needing immediate transition, meaning phase 1. So identifying stakeholders early was pivotal for planning, training, and communicating. Our communication strategy relied on clear phased messaging. So there was an initial email announcing that FreezerPro was sunsetting with FAQs and a comparison chart. The points of contacts were given invitations to Zoom demos. They could invite other individuals from their lab, but at least we know that the point of contact would be there to review the demo. And then final go live instructions, including access request forms, were communicated. We also hosted go live, post go live office hours via Zoom. So LabKey project management group hosted those. So as labs were transitioning and going live, they had times designated where they could get questions answered or support that they needed already scheduled. I will say that consistent messaging was key to building trust and compliance. With regards to our technical setup, from the technical side, we were able to clone our our animal health records prod server and put in a new database credentialing with 0 LabKey issues. We used a fresh database with no interaction with our animal database for separation concerns. So we have separate permissions, separate project managers, separate modules, functionality. We didn't do any custom in-house development for the sample manager module. We opened up network security so the animal database and the sample database can talk to each other. That's a project that'll probably be phase 3 where we're integrating those 2 systems. We think that having Sample Manager totally separated from our animal record system has been an extremely good decision. The separation for concerns allow us to have completely different teams managing those 2 systems. In the animal research world, animal specific data is super sensitive. So we want to make sure that we're controlling who has access to that animal data once it gets linked to the samples. So that is really the biggest reason for the separation of duties. I also think FreezerPro was set up decentralized, so every lab had their own administrator, and not every administrator was properly administering their lab's credentialing. So we decided to go with centralized administration. That way we can get more consistency amongst who will have access, who won't have access, what data they'll have access to, really building in those processes. And then we also engaged our quality assurance group to project manage the transition of the non-FreezerPro users, where we're really going to want to be establishing a protocol for how labs will need to set up their samples if there's going to be any consistent labeling or rules that need to be managed. We transitioned to QA project managing those groups of individuals. Sample Manager was implemented completely vanilla. It does allow, as you saw in the previous presentations, its own flexibility with labeling and stuff, but we didn't add any new custom development. It came out of the box, highly customizable as it was. And so that was really a plus for us. So we also, we did have some server issues that we're going to talk a little bit about. From a LabKey technical perspective, it was pretty much very painless. We did run into issues with IT security regarding our SSL certificates for the new domain and opening security groups. Back to one of the questions earlier, I would say we focused heavily on making sure the stakeholders, like the lab folks, were involved. At Tulane, we have our own dedicated IT group and development group here at the Primate Center. We are under the Tulane University umbrella, but they also have a centralized IT group that does all of the security, the networking, and what we should have recognized was making sure that those users or those stakeholders were involved very early on in the process. So that was one hiccup that we ran into. Instead of giving Sample Manager its own database server during the infrastructure building phase, we stacked the Sample Manager database on top of the current animal records database in order to save money, which in theory, it shouldn't have caused any issues. We did have some query deadlocking after both the animal records and the Sample Manager front-end servers were up and running, which we hadn't seen before. This was either coincidental or caused by the two LabKey servers sharing the same database server. So we moved Sample Manager to have its own dedicated database server. So looking at data migration, initially we asked the labs to download their own data, but this proved not to be feasible, especially given our short 3-month timeline. Next, we tried LabKey's interface extraction, but that was also too slow. Our final solution was to shut down FreezerPro, copy the database, and create a full backup before we go live. LabKey wrote custom migration scripts, which made the process smooth and reduced errors, and their partnership in this was really invaluable. In phase 1, the project management team, which incorporated LabKey and Tulane, supported the labs directly with office hours, data set reviews, and Q&A sessions. For phase 2, as I mentioned, QA took ownership and was introduced to enforce standards and compliance. LabKey developers remain engaged, and we wanted to ensure the adoption was sustainable over time. So their involvement, their meetings with the labs, working independently with the labs on their data was really top-notch when it came to supporting this transition. Some lessons learned would be to engage stakeholders early to avoid surprises. So in our instance, our IT stakeholders should have been included much more earlier. Consider providing a dedicated database server to prevent perhaps performance issues. You really need tight project management and QA oversight when leading this compliance. And then partnering closely with LabKey accelerated our success. Our next steps will include ongoing training, continued support and adoption. We're going to explore expanding metadata customization to better fit lab needs. We'll have future integration with our animal records or and a roadmap for office labs that are ready. And then there'll be continuous QA oversight to ensure the system remains compliant and effective through our centralized administration. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Cathy. It looks like we have a question in. So you indicated that you're going to migrate in phase 3 with the EHR data for the animals, but how are labs currently looking up for their animal data?
So a lot of the labs already have access to the animal side of the EHR system. So what the linkage will do will just give them a one-stop shop and sample manager integration, and it'll be a sample manager has visuals that make it so much more easier, and the samples connected. So a lot of them already have that that access. It'll just be an improved level of access and visibility.
Cool. And then how have technical users, like the end users, been able to adopt the system? Were they able to access training or other resources easily?
I'll tell you, initially LabKey provided us with the how-tos step by step for each function that they may need. So we sent that out early just so that they could get a visual, and then we reinforced that messaging along with those documentations at Go Live. I know Hannah's going to be speaking next, and Hannah was our project manager on the LabKey side, so she can kind of go through the LabKey perspective. I also have Nick and Penny as panelists in case any of them, I don't know, Penny, if you've gotten any feedback from the labs on how the transition has been for them.
Cool.
I have not, and I would assume no news is good news.
There you go. No news is good news.
Yeah.
Because
And
if there was an issue, we would definitely hear about it.
oh yeah. And we always want to hear about it. So that's always good to have. And then do you collaborate with other non-human primate centers? Is your sample manager setup accessible to other centers outside of Tulane?
So we do have, as part of a National Primate Research Center, we do have an NIH-supported consortium of all of the NIH-funded centers that work with non-human primates. So we do use that platform to share best practices and data. Some of those primate centers do use LabKey, and in fact, the reason why we moved to LabKey was because of the pitch that was made during one of the consortiums for other centers that are using LabKey. So it took us several years really to transfer from our legacy system, and several project managers changed hands throughout the implementation. But we are not open source. LabKey developers, we can have the option to have open source data, and some of the primate centers do as far as the development side, not specifically the data because it's super confidential. But we haven't transitioned to that just yet.
And I think that's all of the questions, but we can always follow up with any other questions over email. Thank you so much, Cathy, for presenting. We really appreciate it.
Sure. And if the presentation is going to be made available, I did include in the presentation just the sample communications that we sent out so that the end users can kind of see how we communicated and what we communicated.
Cool. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Cathy.